before I begin, my reading of Kant is a metaphysical one. If anyone happens to know the book of Eric Watkins, which is that of the Kant and the Metaphysics of Causality, I'm quite sympathetic towards that reading. So that is opposed to, say, an epistemological reading of Kant or a two-world ontological kind of reading of Kant. So that's in mind. So what we shall now present is a question of right. The problem which to concern ourselves with today is that of the question of right, as Kant calls it, and the relation of this problem as regards the philosophies of Leibniz, Kant, and Deleuze. The question of right itself arises from what Kant calls error, or a transcendental illusion. Error, says Kant, resides in thought. Error exists not in understanding itself or in the senses, which both act only according to their own laws. Rather, it is the misrepresentation of an appearance as a thing in itself that leads us to error. Or to quote Kant, quote, "Now, as we have no other sources of knowledge but these two," the understanding and the senses, "it follows that error can only arise through the unperceived influence of the sensibility of the understanding. Through this influence, it happens that subjective grounds of judgment become mixed up with the objective ones, and deludes us with a mere dream of an extension of the pure understanding." End of quote. In other words, what Kant places under scrutiny is our applying concepts of the understanding to the thing in itself, that is, positively extending the reach of pure understanding beyond its empirical conditions. This very same problem of the finitude of experience was very much in the mind of the subject of much of Kant's criticism in the Critique of Pure Reason, namely Leibniz, in whom we find this problem as that of the distinction between body and soul. Leibniz maintained that there could not be any essential body, which is to say a form or shape, in the universe, but something more is required for a body to take place. Kant represents this problem of Leibniz's in his critique in a negative fashion due to his claim that Leibniz thought that we could apply the understanding to a thing in itself. However, this is due to Kant's misrepresentation of Leibniz's claims, since what the latter is arguing for, Kant would have to agree with. That is, that since it is obvious that we do not have access to essential forms through our senses, then it is only through the intellect that such an idea can be reached, which is precisely what Leibniz means when he says, quote, "And so, when that distinguished gentleman seeks an explanation in terms of the imagination for the way in which an inherent law works in bodies ignorant of that law, I interpret him to mean that he wants it to be explained through the intellect, for one certainly cannot believe that he requires us to picture sounds or hear colours." End of quote. The problem then is, how can we attain knowledge of something which is independent of our experience? Since experience, however, claims Leibniz, cannot be metaphysically separate from soul or substance, it cannot be separate from the conditions which are outside it, and consequently we necessarily have access to at least some condition which is outside us and not subject to representation. Kant would have to agree with this condition, for if he did not, then this would be to admit that there could be things in themselves, in which case we would not be able to have a unified experience, for as Kant claims, time would then have to be a determination of things in themselves. This would mean that such things would have no external relation of change, nor even change in relation to themselves. As such, the understanding cannot by itself unify experience, but the condition for the unity of experience has to come outside the understanding and experience. As for Kant, the understanding only has access to concepts, that is, the form of space and time. Kant argues that an objective order, or objective succession in time, could never be perceived, since from a concept I could not derive succession regarding the object of the concept. Succession is determined by something that precedes the object of experience. The problem that Kant is presenting here is that between subjective representation and objective representation. Since we are at least partially under the condition of an objective order as regards our representation, that is, a succession which is imposed upon us and which we cannot change, it is then problematic as to what determines these objective conditions, given that we have access to them only through our representation, which is conditioned by its very own conditions of experience, by sensibility. Hence, Leibniz argued that it is only through apperception of the intellect that succession can be apprehended, and as such the conditions of apperception cannot be those of the imagination, since from the concept of the imagination, succession could never be perceived. Therefore, Leibniz argued that since we only have empirical access to phenomena, or appearances in Kant's terms, the conditions of the intellect come from outside it, since we cannot perceive them per se. Remember, we cannot picture sound. As such, Leibniz's claim is that it is impossible that our experience is subject to forms of representation, since these forms are only representations. The forms of representation are what Leibniz calls distinct, and these are opposed to the conditions of apperception which are clear. The difference between distinct and clear perceptions is that since distinct perceptions require form, a distinct perception cannot be clear but is only obscure. This is because, as Leibniz argues, quote, there is no determinate shape in actual things, for none can be appropriate for an infinite number of impressions. End of quote. From which it follows that since, from an infinite regression of forms, no form can be arrived at, no form per se ever exists because the condition of a form is always ad infinitum conditioned by a further regress. Clear perceptions, on the other hand, are conditions which do not distinguish according to phenomena, but according to substance, which is infinite, and of which Leibniz argues that such substance cannot have form. Quote, there is no vacuum, there is no atom. This is specifically to say that just as there are no necessary point boundaries in the universe, neither is there any undifferentiated groundlessness, that is, a vacuum or abyss from which forms arise. Atoms presuppose a universe which is a whole, just as Kant so clearly criticizes. And a vacuum simply presupposes atoms in that, as Leibniz says, it would be, quote, perfectly similar and mutually congruent and could not be distinguished from another. End of quote. It is precisely on the condition of an other that a vacuum can be distinguished and thought of. A clear perception, then, is not clear because it has form or shape, in which case it would be obscure, but precisely because it has no form or shape. However, since there is no vacuum, but rather substance which cannot have form, the shape of a clear perception is indeterminable, just the same as with obscure empirical representation. Kant also agrees with this when he claims that representation is indeterminate, as opposed to infinite. For to representation to be indeterminate means that representation cannot represent a true form. As such, what we want to ask is, by what right does Deleuze, in difference and repetition, distinguish between the clear and the distinct? That is, between differentiation and differentiation, or yet in other terms, actuality and virtuality. In the second chapter of Difference and Repetition, Repetition for Itself, in which Deleuze discusses temporality, we are presented with a distinction, following Burton, between contemporaneity and coexistence. Contemporaneity, Deleuze tells us, represents the present which perpetually passes through itself, as it were, with the past contemporaneous with it, so that each present contains its past. Coexistence, on the other hand, is the flip side of contemporaneity. If the past is contemporaneous with the present, then the whole past is contained in each passing present. But if so, then each present contains its past in relation to which another present, a former or a new present, is already past, and this because the present contains its past. Thus, Deleuze claims that it is the element of past, or pure past, which grounds the present and the future. That is, without the presupposition of the pure past, no present or future can be represented. However, the past in general, as such, cannot be represented, since, as Kant says, our representation is formal or distinct. Deleuze agrees with this, saying that, quote, the past is not itself represented. It is always the former or present present which is represented. End of quote. This pure past is what Deleuze also calls the third synthesis of time, and which he attributes to Kant. That is, before Kant, according to Deleuze, subjects this synthesis to active synthetic identity, which is a mere receptivity of the conditions of sensibility. Deleuze's move here is then, in a way, quite modest. He accordingly makes the claim that temporality is not a subjective condition of experience, since we cannot sense the past per se, and yet it must be presupposed by representation. As such, according to Deleuze, Kant's own conditions presuppose an element which cannot be included in said conditions. However, Kant agreed that the pure past cannot be represented. And this is precisely what is problematic, claims Kant. As such, Kant is asking something very different to what Deleuze is interpreting him as doing, which is that if there were only a succession of presents that were represented, then, according to Kant, quote, we would never be able to distinguish whether that appearance followed objectively upon the first or was simultaneous with it. End of quote. It follows that it would be impossible to distinguish a pure element of past which is at this point merely an illegitimate positive extension of our knowledge. As opposed to what Deleuze is claiming about the pure past, that it cannot be represented, Kant argues that, on the contrary, it is because we do have a representation of determinate succession, along with subjective succession of representation, that the existence of a pure past outside representation, and thus determinate succession as opposed to simultaneity of subjective succession, is problematic. It is problematic precisely because it is only a representation. Consequently, argues Kant, coexistence does not entail the pure past, since such a past is just a representation, and nothing in the concept of representations can endow them with objective succession. As such, according to Kant, Deleuze is guilty of grounding succession on the conditions of mere representation. If our reading is correct, then from this it follows that Deleuze, in his illegitimate attempt to positively extend our knowledge, would seem to fundamentally misinterpret both Leibniz and Kant. Deleuze describes the difference between the contemporaneous present and the coexistent past as that of a differential, or a play in the idea. The differential is the idea differentiating itself, of which Deleuze accuses Kant of, quote, "For Kant, the possibility of experience serves as the proof of its own proof." End of quote. The differentiation of the idea Deleuze calls an actualization of the idea. This is opposed to what Deleuze calls the virtuality of the idea. These two terms, or aspects, correspond to what Kant calls the empirical and the intelligible. Deleuze then proceeds with his argument into what he calls the structure of the idea, by which he means, in Kant's case, the circularity of the ground. Deleuze says, quote, "If it is true that the two aspects of differentiation are constituted by qualities and extensities, then we should say that ideas are actualized by differentiation. For ideas to be actualized is to be differentiated. In themselves and in their virtuality, they are thus completely undifferentiated. However, they are by no means indeterminate. On the contrary, they are completely differentiated. In this sense, the virtual is by no means a vague notion, but one which possesses full objective reality. It cannot be confused with the possible, which lacks reality." End of quote. But ideas, Kant claims, are only extended indeterminately far. As such, contra Deleuze, ideas, Kant argues, are completely indeterminate, and accordingly the virtual is a vague or problematic notion precisely because from representation no objective reality follows. Thus, Deleuze's distinction between differentiation and differentiation is illegitimate because it presupposes the objective reality of succession in order to make the distinction, which nevertheless cannot be arrived at through the concepts of ideas, concepts through which we can have no possible access to an objective reality. As such, Deleuze's question of the ens omni modo determinatum, which he says, quote, "must be posed as follows: something which exists only in the idea may be completely determined, differentiated, and yet lack those determinations which constitute actual existence. It is undifferentiated, not yet even individuated. If you call the state of a completely differentiated idea distinct, and the forms of quantitative and qualitative differentiation clear, then we must reject the rule of proportionality between the clear and the distinct. Ideas as they exist in themselves are distinct obscure." End of quote. This question places the problematic unknown X, or the noumenon, which Deleuze also calls the dark precursor, between the actual and the virtual, that is, places the condition of the determinable by which a determination may have access to the indeterminate, between two concepts, namely the virtual and the actual idea. However, asks Kant, by what right does it follow from these concepts that the idea can be divided into two states of difference, when this division is only done by the formal division of the idea itself, which is to say that both distinctions are formal, and moreover, such distinctions cannot in themselves prove the distinction between objective reality and the possible which lacks reality? Leibniz, in his turn, raises the question that since what is distinct to the idea is form, yet those forms being phenomenal, and since clear perception is obscure through the lack of form, how can an idea be distinct For there is then nothing which would make an idea distinct but a phenomenon, the concept of its form, from which no communication between forms would be possible, and as such no representation of an idea would be possible either. It would appear that Deleuze's interpretation of both Leibniz and Kant is misguided to the extent of his criticism not touching either one. As such, the question is that since it's portraying the problem in a way which simply neglects or ignores the problem of the question of right, what can become of Deleuze's criticism of these theories of Genesis? And further, in light of this, can a theory of Genesis be constructed from Deleuze's problematic philosophy? Thank you. Of causality, I'm quite sympathetic towards that reading. So that is opposed to, say, an epistemological reading of Kant or a two-world ontological kind of reading of Kant. So that's in mind. So what we shall now present is a question of right. The problem which to concern ourselves with today is that of the question of right, as Kant calls it, and the relation of this problem as regards the philosophies of Leibniz, Kant, and Deleuze. The question of right itself arises from what Kant calls error, or a transcendental illusion. Error, says Kant, resides in thought. Error exists not in understanding itself or in as a quick note before I begin, my reading of Kant is a metaphysical one. If anyone happens to know the book of Eric Watkins, which is that of the Kant and the metaphysical, the understanding. Through this influence, it happens that subjective grounds of judgment become mixed up with the objective ones, and deludes us with the mere dream of an extension of the pure understanding. End of quote. In other words, what Kant places under scrutiny is our applying concepts of the understanding to the thing in itself, that is, positive senses, which both act only according to their own laws. Rather, it is the misrepresentation of an appearance as a thing in itself that leads us to error. Or to quote Kant, quote, "Now, as we have no other sources of knowledge but these two," the understanding and the senses, "it follows that error can only arise through the unperceived influence of the sensibility of